Professor Freeman puts the case graphically thus. Barring disaster, the world is on a historic transition to a truly global economy and labor market that should produce a rough income parity among nations and make poverty history. Hundreds of millions of people in China, India, and elsewhere are going to be lifted out of the most mind-numbing, soul-destroying, back-breaking poverty. Never before in history have so many people been lifted out of poverty so quickly. Never before in history has human welfare improved so much for so many. That is the good news. The bad news is that this is going to happen at the expense of low and medium wage workers in the developed world, including Singapore. Sooner or later, Chinese and Indian wages will approach first world levels. But the transition will take 40 to 50 years, according to Freeman. I think there's a chance it might happen sooner, 30 to 40 years, but still, that's a long time. In the meantime, the rich in the rich world will get richer, and the poor will get poorer. That is not a situation that is morally, politically, or economically sustainable, especially in democracies. What should advanced economies do? Professor Alan Blinder, another professor in the United States, the former vice chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, he and many people have said the solution is not to erect protectionist barriers to close off your economy to the rest of the world. The solution for the U.S. and for developed countries, he writes, is to repair and thicken the tattered safety net that supports workers who fall off the labor market trapeze, improving programs ranging from unemployment insurance to job retraining, health insurance, pensions, and right down to public assistance. I agree. It is virtually impossible, I think it is ethically impossible, for any first world economist who thinks seriously about the great doubling and of global income inequality to remain a market fundamentalist. Now, does all this apply to Singapore? Yes. We can't hide. Let me illustrate this point with a story that my son used to like very much when he was much younger. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, you all are familiar with Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure, go on a camping trip one day. After eating their sandwiches and having their drink, they both lie down for the night and they go to sleep. A few hours later, Holmes wakes up and shakes his friend. And he says, "Watson, look up and tell me what you see." Watson says, "I see zillions and zillions of stars." "What does that tell you?" Holmes asks Watson. "Astronomically," Watson says, "it tells me that there are billions of galaxies and possibly billions of planets. Astrologically, I see Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce that the time is about 3:15 a.m. Theologically, I believe that God is an all-powerful creator. And meteorologically, I surmise tomorrow will be a beautiful day." "Why? What does it tell you, Holmes?" Holmes reaches for his pipe in the dark, sticks it in his mouth, and mumbles, "Someone has stolen our tent, Watson." The current debate about the so-called hyper-globalization, of which our current controversy in Singapore, a rather virulent anti-foreign mood in Singapore, is an instance, resembles this Holmes-Watson dialogue. On the one hand, globalization's true believers are struck by the stars, the wide horizon and infinitude of possibilities, glorious multitude of opportunities. On the other hand, uncertain citizens notice there is no tent, leaving them subject to the elements, forever at the mercy of events in distant places, like Europe, as you just heard, threatened by foreigners crossing our shores and crowding us out, and so on, with no possibility of safe harbor. India may have 25% of the world's malnourished, but it also has 30% of its software engineers, which means 3 out of 10 software engineers in the entire world is in India. Every year, it turns out about 1.5 million university graduates. So every 2 years, India produces the equivalent of a Singapore in terms of university graduates. 350,000 of them every year are engineers. And thanks to the British Raj, they all speak English. Globalization means not only capital mobility, but also job mobility. US blue-collar workers discovered how exportable jobs can be in the 1980s. We discovered over the last 2 decades how much pressure there can be on wages at the low end of the scale, and as a result, the great doubling of the workforce, global workforce. Today, white-collar workers in high-tech industries and services in the first world are discovering they are not immune from this pressure. There is no tent for everyone. The economics of this process is compelling. You take simple thing like bookkeeping. In the US, the average annual salary of an accountant is US $60,000. In India, it is around $6,000. In the Philippines, half that, $3,600. US companies, therefore, can cut costs between 25 and 35% or 50% by moving their backroom operations, everything from bookkeeping to financial analysis, etc., overseas. So can Singapore companies. In part because of the unhappiness over the number of foreigners here, the government has tightened the entry of foreign workers into the country. But many Singapore companies, especially SMEs, can't find Singaporeans to do these jobs. Thus, some of them will think of relocating elsewhere in search of cheaper foreign labor. Foreign labor that many of us don't want here. You can restrict the number of foreigners who come to Singapore, but you can't restrict the number of foreigners elsewhere. They don't disappear just because you don't want to see them here. There is no tent. Even computer jobs are declining in the US because of competition from elsewhere by some 10-20% over the past 5 years. And the wages of tech workers have stagnated even in the US, growing by less than the inflation rate. Why? Because General Electric can now run a huge research operation in India, as does McKinsey, Microsoft and McKinsey also. According to a recent McKinsey study, U.S. financial sector will export as many as 500,000 jobs overseas. This is in addition to all the jobs it has already lost. And next time you see a Hollywood movie, don't leave the theater until you see, when the movie ends, just watch the credits. You will discover that very often the music for quite a few Hollywood movies are now scored in Bollywood, in India. So even the music can be done elsewhere. So all that singing and dancing in Indian music has obviously paid off. The bottom line of companies improves as they cut costs by moving jobs to low-cost countries. Stockholders are happy as equity prices rise together with profits, but the army of unemployed white-collar workers also grows. What can you do? You can't rail at globalization or like King Canute, command the waves to retreat because the waves won't retreat. What China, India, Russia, the Philippines, elsewhere are doing is no different from what Singapore did in the 1970s or Japan in the 1950s. There is really no choice but to retrain, retool, and find new niches. Globalization, for better or worse, is a permanent revolution. We have to get used to living on its cutting edge. But can we at least provide some shade, some degree of protection to the vulnerable? I think we should. I'll reserve to later a discussion of what we might do. In the time remaining to me, let me speak to you as graphically as possible of the political implications of income inequality in Singapore. Ultimately, your generation will have to deal with these political challenges. Where is this? Okay. Take a look at this first map. This is what Singapore looked like in 1963. It looked like a tortoise. It looks very different right now. All that's blue, this is 1963 general election. This many decades before most of you were born. I was about 8 years old then. It's more than 50 years ago. The area colored blue were areas that the PAP lost. in 1963. Those were constituencies that were won by a party that was called the Barisan Socialists, which means Socialist Front in Malay. It was an extreme left party. Some of them were communist. Most were left. The Barisan Socialists won 13 seats out of 51 seats in 1963. The PAP won 37. This is how Singapore looks like now. It's got one of these space age. It looks like a space age creature, with claws and so on. Now, this map shows what happened in the 2011 GE, the one that happened last year. The areas colored red are areas where the PAP did exceptionally well, receiving more than 60% of the vote, which is above its national average. You would notice that the red areas coincide almost exactly with the areas the Barisan Socialists won in 1963. Doesn't this work? Yeah. You see that? How come? Well, it isn't because the PAP is now the extreme left party or has become dominated by the communists. Those Barisan areas that you saw earlier, those blue areas, were mostly rural areas in 1963. They have since been developed. It's Jurong, Bukit Timah, West Coast, Sembawang up there in the north, Yishun also. They were all rural areas. They have now been developed, and they are now almost wholly public housing areas with little or no private housing. Almost all, not all, almost all, the areas where the PAP received less than 60% of the votes had substantial private housing. The ruling party lost 6%, 6 percentage points compared to the 2006 election, largely because, in my view, because of the upper middle class. Why should this be so? Hasn't this class benefited the most from the PAP rule? Now, take a look at this map which I showed you earlier. As I said, it shows you the distribution of household income in the US. If we had similar fine-grained data for Singapore, showing household income by every percentile, every decile, every percentile, I believe that our graph will look very much like this. But we don't have such data. What the Singapore Department of Statistics gives out is it gives you the average for every decile. In other words, it gives you the average from 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 90 to 100, etc. So even then, the graph looks like this. Right? We already have income stagnation up to, I would say, 50th, 60th percentile. In other words, income is not moving. Median income, do you all know what median income means? Median income is the midpoint, above 50% above earn more, 50% below earn less. The median income in Singapore grew by only 11% over the last decade, in other words, 2001 to 2010. That's just an average of 1 percentage point a year. That is better than almost every OECD country, but not so good compared to what Singaporeans experienced in the 1990s and earlier. Between the 60th, and this is my guess, between the 60th percentile, you see over there, and I'd say the 95th percentile, we have slowing income growth. Income is growing, but it's slowing. The middle class, or more accurately, I would say the upper middle class, have seen their expenses grow, healthcare, housing, etc., looking after aged parents, education expenses, and so on, while their incomes have not grown as much. Indeed, as in the United States, an increasing portion of income growth in Singapore has been going to the very top, 95th percentile and above. It is not quite 1% versus the rest yet in Singapore, but we are not that far off. Here is the political crux. Unlike lower income groups in Singapore, the working class, the middle class, the middle classes who live in public housing, the upper middle class gets relatively little by way of transfer payments, subsidies, etc., health, education, housing, above all, from the state. And the evidence suggests they are the ones who swung more against the PAP. So this is what the new politics, you all have heard the term new normal, new politics in Singapore will amount to. And when you think about it, it isn't very different from the old or current politics of most other advanced economies, including the US. And it is this. Few Singaporeans would disagree the state should continue to do a great deal for the most disadvantaged members of society. But can you afford to provide more extensive social safety nets, supporting up to 95th, 80th, 85th percentage of households, for housing, for example, for healthcare? It used to be that one set of national policies benefited everyone in Singapore. With globalization and income stratification, it is no longer the case that one set of national policies can benefit everyone. The new politics in Singapore consists of the unaccustomed recognition that every social compact is temporary, the product of a negotiated political settlement. This is the world you will live in. This is the politics that you will have to live with. So with that, let me conclude and take your questions. Thank you.